The pilot knew he was dying. Not from enemy fire, not from wounds, from something far more humiliating for a warrior of the Imperial Japanese Navy: mechanical failure and bad weather. Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga pulled back on the stick of his Mitsubishi A6M20, trying to coax just a little more altitude out of the faltering engine. Below him, the gray waters of the North Pacific churned like molten lead. Ahead, through the fog and mist, the rocky outline of Akutan Island emerged like a ghost. It was July 4th, 1942. America was celebrating Independence Day. Koga was trying not to crash into the side of a mountain. His Zero had taken damage during the attack on Dutch Harbor 2 days earlier. Not much, a single bullet, maybe two. But it was enough. Oil pressure dropping, engine temperature climbing. The instrument panel told him a story he didn't want to hear. He was going down. But here's what Koga didn't know, couldn't know. As he lined up for an emergency landing on what looked like flat grassland near the island's coast, he was about to hand the United States the most valuable intelligence prize of the entire Pacific War. He was about to give them the Zero. For 2 years, this fighter had been untouchable. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Singapore to the Dutch East Indies, the Zero had carved through Allied aircraft like a sword through silk. American pilots called it the Japanese Messerschmitt. British pilots in Burma said it was the devil himself, painted gray-green and mounted on wings. It could outturn anything in the sky, outclimb anything that flew. In the hands of Japan's veteran naval aviators, men who'd been training since before the war, who'd cut their teeth over China, it was nearly invincible. American pilots were dying by the dozens trying to figure out how to fight it. They'd captured pieces before, wreckage from crashes, twisted metal pulled from jungle clearings and coral reefs. Engineers pored over fragments trying to reverse engineer the design. But you can't understand how a bird flies by studying its broken feathers. They needed one intact. They needed one they could fly. Koga never saw the marsh. From 500 feet up through the fog and sea spray, that stretch of tundra near the coast looked solid, flat, like the kind of emergency landing strip he'd trained on back at Yokosuka. He dropped his flaps, cut his speed, lined up his approach. The Zero's wheels touched down and immediately sank. What looked like grassland was actually muskeg, a thick, waterlogged bog covered in a deceptive layer of vegetation. The moment the Zero's landing gear hit the ground gave way. The wheels dug in like anchors. Physics took over. The fighter flipped. Nose over tail, the Zero pitched forward and slammed upside down into the marsh. The canopy crushed. The propeller bent. The engine buried itself in black mud and ice-cold water. Tadayoshi Koga died instantly, his neck broken, still strapped into his seat. For 5 weeks, his body hung there in the wreckage, suspended in the cockpit, slowly freezing in the Aleutian summer that never really gets warm. Nobody came looking for him. On the other side of the island, a different story was playing out. The U.S. Navy had personnel stationed on Akutan. Not many. A small weather detachment and a handful of sailors tasked with watching the sea lanes. They'd seen the Zero come down, watched it disappear into the fog somewhere along the western coast. But getting there wasn't simple. Akutan Island is a volcanic rock jutting out of the Bering Sea. It's covered in tundra ravines and treacherous terrain. There were no roads, no vehicles that could handle the landscape. And with Japanese forces still operating in the Aleutians after their attack on Dutch Harbor, nobody was in a hurry to go wandering around looking for crashed enemy fighters. Still, someone reported it. The sighting made its way up the chain of command. And it sat there. For weeks, the crashed Zero languished in the marsh, slowly being reclaimed by the elements. Koga's body grew stiff in the cold. Saltwater began its patient work on the aluminum airframe. Seabirds nested in the wreckage. It wasn't until late July that a Navy patrol finally made it to the crash site. What they found stopped them cold. Lieutenant William Thies was the first to reach the wreckage. He'd expected fragments, twisted metal, maybe an engine block they could salvage for intelligence purposes. What he found instead was a nearly intact fighter aircraft, flipped upside down, remarkably preserved by the cold and the bog. The plane had barely burned. No fire. The fuel tanks had ruptured on impact, but the swampy ground had smothered any chance of ignition. The airframe was dented, sure. The propeller was destroyed, but the wings were whole, the control surfaces intact. The cockpit, though crushed, hadn't disintegrated. And then Thies saw the body. He radioed back to base. The message was urgent, almost frantic. They'd found something big, really big. Intact Zero. Repeat, Intact Zero. The recovery operation began in August. A salvage team was assembled from the crews stationed at Dutch Harbor, engineers, mechanics, anyone who knew aircraft. They hauled equipment across the island on foot, winches, cables, tools, canvas tarps. The terrain fought them every step. Fog rolled in without warning. Rain turned the ground into soup. But they kept working. First, they had to extract Koga's body. It was grim work. Nobody spoke much during that part. They wrapped him in canvas and buried him nearby, marking the grave with a simple cross. Whatever else he was enemy combatant invader, he'd been a pilot. That meant something. Then came the Zero. Lifting a 6,000-pound aircraft out of a bog in the middle of nowhere with no heavy machinery is not a job for the faint of heart. They dug trenches around the wreckage, secured cables to the airframe, built makeshift ramps from driftwood and salvaged timber. Inch by inch, they dragged the Zero out of the marsh. It took days. When they finally hauled it onto solid ground and flipped it upright, the engineers just stood there staring. Despite the damage, despite the mud and the cold and the violence of the crash, the fighter was astonishingly complete. One of the mechanics ran his hand along the wing, felt the rivets, the smooth, flush construction, the lightweight design. "Jesus," he muttered. "No wonder we can't catch them." Getting the Zero off Akutan Island was its own nightmare. They couldn't fly it out. The damage was too severe, and there was no runway anyway. So they disassembled it, carefully, methodically. Every panel, every control rod, every bolt was labeled and catalogued. The wings came off. The engine was disconnected. The fuselage was sectioned. They packed it all into crates. On August 15, 1942, a barge arrived to haul the pieces to a waiting ship. The crew loaded the crates like they were handling the crown jewels. In a way, they were. This was the most valuable piece of enemy hardware the United States had captured in the entire war. The Zero was shipped to Dutch Harbor, then to Seattle, then by rail to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, then finally to the Naval Air Station at San Diego's Auxiliary Field in Otay Mesa. By September, it sat in a hangar surrounded by some of the best aviation engineers in the country. And they went to work. The first thing they did was weigh it. Piece by piece, component by component, they measured every part of the Zero. What they found astonished them. The entire aircraft fully loaded weighed just over 6,000 pounds. For context, an American F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's frontline fighter at the time, weighed nearly 8,000 pounds. The Zero was a featherweight by comparison. That weight savings came from everywhere. The aluminum was thinner. There was no armor plating protecting the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The construction was elegant, minimalist, almost artistic in its simplicity. It was also terrifying, because it meant that every Zero flying over the Pacific was a death trap. One good burst and the whole thing could come apart. The fuel tanks could explode. The controls could fail. The pilot had nothing between him and enemy bullets except thin aluminum skin and luck. But it also meant the Zero could do things no American fighter could. The engineers rebuilt the engine first, cleaned the saltwater corrosion, replaced damaged seals, tested the compression. The Nakajima Sakai radial engine roared to life on the test stand, and the sound echoed through the hangar like a ghost waking up. Then they rebuilt the airframe, straightened the bent metal, repaired the crushed canopy, reattached the wings. Every step was documented, photographed, analyzed. By late September, the Zero was whole again. It sat on the tarmac, painted in its original gray-green camouflage, the red Hinomaru, the rising sun insignia, still visible on the fuselage and wings. American mechanics swarmed over it, making final checks. And then they asked the question that mattered most. Who's going to fly this thing? Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders drew the short straw. He wasn't picked randomly. Sanders was a test pilot, experienced, calm under pressure. The kind of guy who could take an unfamiliar aircraft into the sky and bring it back in one piece. But even he admitted later that climbing into the cockpit of an enemy fighter, one that had killed American pilots, one that represented everything terrifying about Japan's air superiority, was unnerving. The cockpit was cramped. Everything was labeled in Japanese. The instruments were different. The stick felt different. Even the smell was foreign oil and canvas and something faintly metallic. Sanders ran through the checklist, or what he assumed was the checklist. There was no manual, no guide, just instinct and experience. He fired up the engine. The propeller spun. The engine caught. The whole aircraft vibrated with restrained energy like a caged animal ready to leap. Sanders taxied to the runway, pushed the throttle forward, and the Zero lifted into the California sky like it weighed nothing. For the first few seconds, Sanders didn't breathe. The takeoff was shockingly short. The Zero seemed to leap off the runway, climbing at an angle that would have stalled any American fighter. The stick was light, almost too light. The slightest input sent the aircraft banking, rolling, responding with a sensitivity that felt alive. Sanders leveled off at 5,000 feet and began testing. He rolled the Zero. It snapped over with frightening speed. He pulled into a climbing turn. The fighter clawed for altitude without hesitation, the engine singing. He tried a loop. The Zero went over the top so smoothly it felt like cheating. Then he tried something American pilots had learned never to do in a dogfight with a Zero. He tried to turn with it. He banked hard left, pulled the stick back. The Zero rolled into the turn and just kept turning. Tighter and tighter. The nose came around in a circle so tight, Sanders felt the G-forces pressing him into the seat. He'd turned 360 degrees before he even realized it. In an F4F Wildcat, that same turn would have taken twice as long and bled off most of his speed. In the Zero, he'd barely lost any airspeed at all. Sanders keyed the radio. "Jesus Christ," he said. "This thing can turn." Over the next several weeks, Sanders flew the Zero again and again. Each flight revealed something new. The incredible roll rate, the absurd climb performance, the way it could pull into a vertical climb and hang there almost hovering before sliding back down. It was like flying a machine built by magicians. But the tests also revealed the flaws. The Zero's ailerons. The control surfaces on the wings that controlled roll stiffened up dramatically at high speed. Above 300 miles per hour, they became almost immovable. The pilot couldn't roll quickly, couldn't maneuver aggressively. The aircraft that was so nimble at low speed became sluggish and unresponsive when pushed fast. The dive performance was terrible. The Zero didn't like going straight down. It shook, it buffeted. The controls got mushy. Trying to pull out of a steep dive felt like wrestling with the plane. And the construction, that beautiful, lightweight construction, was fragile. Sanders did a high-speed pass one day and felt the wings flex. Actually, flex, like they were made of cardboard. Any sustained high-G maneuver risked structural failure. The airframe couldn't handle the stress. The engineers watching from the ground scribbled notes furiously. Because suddenly everything made sense. American pilots had been trying to fight the Zero on its terms. They'd been dogfighting, trying to turn with it, trying to outmaneuver it in slow, circling engagements where the Zero's advantages were absolute. And they'd been dying. But the tests revealed a different approach. Don't turn with the Zero. Don't try to outclimb it. Don't get slow. Instead, dive on it from above. Hit it fast. Use speed and altitude. Make one pass guns blazing, then keep going. Dive away. Use the American fighters' better high-speed handling and stronger airframes to escape. Climb back up. Reset. Do it again. Never get into a turning fight. Never let the Zero dictate the engagement. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. The findings were compiled into a report and distributed throughout the Navy and Marine Corps. Pilots read it like scripture. Training programs were rewritten. Tactics were overhauled. The doctrine became known as boom and zoom. Dive, shoot, climb, repeat. And it worked. The impact of the Akutan Zero is hard to overstate. By 1943, American pilots were consistently beating Zeros in combat, not because they had better planes, not yet, but because they understood the enemy. They knew its weaknesses. They exploited them ruthlessly. The kill ratios started to shift. Where once the Zero dominated, now it was being shredded. Japanese pilots, still trained in the pre-war doctrine of turning dogfights, found themselves outmatched by Americans who refused to play that game. Grumman used the data from the Akutan Zero to design the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically built to counter the Zero's strengths. Tough, fast, powerful. The Hellcat could absorb punishment. The Zero couldn't dish out and hit back with devastating firepower. By 1944, the Zero was obsolete. Not because it had gotten worse, but because the Americans had gotten smarter. The Akutan Zero flew for over a year. Sanders and other test pilots put hundreds of hours on the airframe, pushing it to its limits and beyond. They tested it against every American fighter in service, mock dogfights, speed trials, climb competitions. Every time they learned something new. But the Zero was mortal. On February 15, 1944, during a training flight, the engine failed. The pilot, not Sanders this time, but another test aviator, tried to make it back to the airfield. He didn't. The Zero crashed on the runway approach and was destroyed. The pilot survived. The Zero didn't. Its remains were scrapped. The data lived on. Tadayoshi Koga never knew what he'd done. He died thinking he'd simply failed. A mechanical failure. A bad landing. Another casualty of war forgotten in the vastness of the Pacific. But his Zero changed the course of history. It gave the United States the key to defeating Japan's air superiority. It saved countless American lives. It shortened the war, maybe by months, maybe by years. Historians still debate the exact impact, but nobody disputes that the Akutan Zero was one of the most significant intelligence coups of World War II. In 1997, Koga's family was finally informed of what happened. His sister traveled to Akutan Island, to the site where her brother had died 55 years earlier. She stood in the marsh, now overgrown, where the Zero had crashed. She placed flowers, and she thanked the men who'd recovered his body, who'd buried him with respect, who'd treated him even in death as a fellow pilot. There's a strange poetry to the whole story. A fighter designed to dominate the skies became the instrument of its own defeat. A pilot's tragic death became the key to saving his enemies. A machine built for war ended up teaching peace, or at least teaching survival. The Zero that wouldn't die did die, but not before it became something else. A teacher, a warning, a reminder that in war, sometimes, the greatest victories come from understanding your enemy, not just destroying them. And for the men who flew it, who studied it, who learned its secrets, the Akutan Zero was more than just a captured aircraft. It was a ghost that changed everything. Years later, Eddie Sanders was asked what it felt like to fly the Zero for the first time. He paused, thought about it, and then he said something that still echoes. It felt like I was flying with the dead, like Koga was sitting behind me watching, wondering what we'd do with what he'd given us. He paused again. I hope we honored it. I hope we learned. They did. The wreckage of the Akutan Zero is gone now, scrapped decades ago, but photographs remain. Test reports, film footage of Sanders rolling the captured fighter through California, skies the rising sun insignia, stark against the blue. And in archives and museums, the story lives on. The story of a fighter that was supposed to be invincible. The story of a pilot who never made it home. And the story of how a single aircraft, pulled from a freezing marsh on a forgotten island, helped turn the tide of the largest war in human history. The Zero that wouldn't die. Until it did. And even then, it kept fighting.